Welcome back to another episode of the Kings Pulse podcast presented by the Kings Herald. My name is Brendan Nunez, and we are here the day after the 2023 NBA draft. Kings made a couple moves, including 2 picks, and their highest pick, sitting at 34, was Colby Jones. I brought on a draft expert today, Stone Hansen, co-host of the Upside Swings pod, one of my favorite pods this time of year. And I know that you're a decent fan of Colby, Stone. So first of all, thanks for joining the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, and I guess before we get into Colby, since I haven't talked about, the meat and potatoes of this episode, we'll be talking about Colby, obviously. But just want to acknowledge the Kings trading 24 and Rashawn Holmes to Dallas to clear cap space. And I don't know the exact numbers, but they went from somewhere around 20 million to more like 33 million in cap space. I think they're the only real team that is in spots to maybe threaten a run in the postseason that has cap space. The other teams are totally just kind of at the bottom of the league when it comes to projections for next year. But do you have any thoughts on just the opportunity cost of using 24 to clear cap space? Because they made a lot of room, but even the guy that Dallas ended up taking there, Olivier Maxence Prosper, somebody that, for example, would have made a lot of sense in Sacramento.
Yeah. I think it makes sense for sure if you think some guys that you like are going to be there, right? Like if you have 38 and you had Colby pretty high up on your board, or somebody like Max Lewis was there, like I think those guys make a lot of sense. And if you felt confident that you were going to be there with your pick, then I think this is pretty good process, because I think now you wind up where you can give, hefty money to someone in free agency and outbid a lot of people that aren't going to have that sort of financial flexibility. So I actually quite like it, because I felt like this draft was really wild in terms of where I had guys and where they ended up going. And I think that if you look at it from the perspective of how flat it was, this makes a lot of sense.
I'm with you. And I'd imagine that, there were probably some guys. This doesn't happen until the time of the pick, because not only does Dallas want to make sure that their guy's there, I'm sure, or one of their guys, maybe it's not just one, but also maybe Sacramento was waiting to see if somebody was going to make it there. And, there's a decent chance that Chris Murray going at 23, if that doesn't happen, that maybe you're talking about a different situation at 24. But I think it's a good move for Sacramento. And then they end up moving up to 34 from 38. They included a future second rounder. I didn't see clarification exactly on what second rounder that is, but they have a lot of future seconds from other teams as well. And Colby Jones, the guy that had a late first, early second valuation for a lot of people. I think you had him a little bit higher than that, but just to go through basic measurements, combine measurements, 6'4.5" without shoes, so about 6'6" with shoes, 6'8" wingspan, 21 years old. He's just completed his junior year at Xavier. And a guy that does a little bit of everything, 15 points, 5.7 boards, 4.4 assists. You got 1.3 steals in there, even 0.6 blocks for a guy that's not that big, and efficient. 50% from the field, 37.8% from three. And we'll get more into the specifics of all this, obviously. And there's the 65.3% from the free throw line. But I kind of wanted to start with more of a general, how did you feel about Colby's value going into the draft? We'll get into the specifics of him as a player, but sort of where did you have him ranked and expect the sort of range for him on draft night?
Yeah, I was a little bit higher, I think, than a lot of people. I had him at 20 on my board, so somebody that I thought, was worth a fairly high first round pick. I guess middle of the first round, you would say. But I think most people had him, from maybe like that 25 to 35 kind of range. I think that's where most people expected him to go, and that's where I expected him to go. I didn't think he would go top 20, but for to have him fall to 38, I think is really solid value for the type of player that Colby is. And I think that a lot of stuff didn't go as expected last night for me in terms of where ranges were for guys that were expected, and where they ended up being taken. So I think Colby was definitely one of those type of guys.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously Sacramento really liked him. If you're sitting there at 38, you move up a couple spots. I would imagine it's specifically with Colby in mind, um, and a guy that does a little bit of everything. But I think what I want to start with, because it also goes with a question that I got to ask McNair yesterday, and kind of can start with his thoughts on Colby. But there's a lot of things he does well, but I think the 3-point shot is a little bit of a question when you look at compared to years prior, right? There's that 37.8% on three this year. That was on 3.3 a game, but you go back last year, 29.2% on three on two a game. Freshman year, 33% on 1.8 a game. And if you look at catch and shoot numbers, last year, 43%, year prior, 32.3, freshman year, 34.6. And there is the free throw numbers where he's a career throughout his 3 years, 67.9% from three. We can start with me. I kind of, the first thing I asked McNair was, where do you get the confidence and the belief that the shooting is real for Colby? And then kind of asked a little bit about his versatility. So we'll start with what McNair says here, and then I want to get your thoughts, Stone. But I also want to say real quick, anybody on the audio side, I will level out the audio so it sounds fine. But if you're on the video side, this McNair audio might be a little quiet. And right after I ask the second question, there's a little bit of a screech from a mic. So I'm just giving a little bit of a headphone warning. But here is McNair on Kobe's shooting and then some of his versatility.
Hey, Monty, two questions for you regarding Colby. Just to start, a guy that shot a lot better from three this year than years prior, and not the best free throw numbers. So what gives you confidence that the three-point shooting you saw this year is real with Colby?
Our scouts do a great job of, and I mentioned Greg and others who do a bunch of intel work, but Kobe's work ethic and, the person that he is, his character, those are the types of things that we like to see for guys as they improve throughout college, and that they'll continue to improve when they get into our situation. But it's all the other stuff that Colby does too. He's got great touch. The shot improved obviously this year, but that he can get in there and make a play with a pass, an offensive rebound on the offensive end, that defensively can guard, up and down. Probably not a lot of centers, but he's strong, he's big, and he's going to be very versatile on that end as well. But obviously the shooting is a big part of the NBA these days, and we like to see the growth that he's shown.
And how much do you value that versatility that he supplies on both ends, playing on and off the ball on both sides of the floor, and how important is that as a connecting piece?
Yeah, we've got, as you know, we got two All NBA guys that we're building around, and so guys that can help them on both ends of the floor. They're going to do, Domas and Foxy going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us on the offensive end, but guys that can be connecting pieces, guys that can finish plays, guys that can make the intermediate play, the hockey pass, especially with the offense that Coach Brown and Coach Triano have. We want high IQ guys that can come in here and just figure out a way to contribute no matter who they're on the floor with.
Yeah, Stone, I'll leave it pretty open-ended to you after that. Like, what stands out to you from Monty's thoughts on Kobe?
I think he, at the end there especially, just really identified what the idealistic role for Colby is, which is being that sort of connective piece that is just a glue guy that keeps everything flowing and going really smoothly. I think the Kings have a lot of obviously like shooters off ball, and I think they have a lot of guys that can kind of make those plays. But I think Colby, in specific, is someone that probably isn't as strong a shooter as the rest of you guys that you have with Malik and Herter. But I think that he is somebody that can be a bit more consistent in terms of the like crispness and quickness of the reads that he makes as a connective passer. And I think that's an important role that he can fill. And I think that he's a really solid finisher too, which we can get into. But I think, yeah, ultimately, I think that's really the idealistic role. And that's cool to see that, McNair already has that sort of vision for him in terms of what he can provide for the Kings.
Yeah, he talked a little earlier in that presser about how kind of when, his personal evaluation and scouts evaluations, how this guy is as a person happens to line up with a lot of his metrics that, it makes it an easy decision. And Kobe was one of those guys. We talked about 3-point shooting, which it seems like a lot of people believe in, but I think there is some questions there. Outside of that though, like when it comes, I think there's potential here for a three level play finisher. not a guy that's necessarily creating on three levels, but there's that 3-point shooting that we mentioned. There's a great floater. His synergy has his number of 54.3% on 77 attempts throughout the course of this year. His touch at the rim that you mentioned and Monty mentioned there as well. At the rim for synergy, 62.2%. I think it's pretty cliche with a maybe white dude that's not the most athletic, but he's crafty around the rim and like I think creative in finding angles, different things of like same foot, same hand, or just leaning a little bit of a different way to get an interesting angle, or if he has to go with a high floater, or if he needs to sneak it around somebody. I think he does that well. But what do you think of Colby as that 3-level play finisher?
Yeah, I think that's definitely what he's best at. Like I think that playing him more as a wing or like an undersized wing, I guess, not even undersized because he's like 6'5", 6'6". Nowadays, that's fine for small forwards. But I think it could be like a shooting guard, a small forward, somebody that is finishing those plays, is able to. I really like how he's able to finish with either hand and attack from either side. Like that's something I really look at with finishers, and I think like when you take, for example, someone like Kobe Buffkin, who I really like, but he's very left-handed predominant in terms of where he's attacking from. Colby's very comfortable with both sides. Like if he's coming from the left, coming from the right, finishing with his right or left, it doesn't really matter. You mentioned that touch. That's what I'm relying more upon in terms of the outcome of shooting. And I don't think he's going to be a particularly versatile shooter by any means. He's not going to be, coming off of screens a whole lot or doing that sort of thing, drifting in either way. You have other guys that can fill that sort of role. But I think that Colby, I project him to be a pretty serviceable spot up guy. Probably not like super high volume, but I think he's somebody that you can feel fairly confident about to hit an open spot up. And I think that's what you really need from someone that's going to be in that sort of connective role. And I think that he can be able to provide that at the least.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, just hitting those spot ups or recognizing when defenses are overplaying you, cutting back door and finishing, or just being able to attack closeouts. I think that's all there. Like you kind of mentioned some of the playmaking that I think is really intriguing. And it seems to me like a little bit as more of a connective guy rather than somebody you really want initiating your offense. And obviously that's not what Sacramento would be asking him to do with De'Aaron and Domas out there. But I think that, there's a thought that maybe if one of those guys is sitting, what level of responsibility can you give Colby? And you guys on Upside Swings had a good conversation about Colby's passing. I think it seemed to be something that was a little bit, you guys had some healthy disagreements, but where are you at with Colby as a playmaker?
I think where I come down on is like his burst is very average, like coming off of dribble moves. His handle is very average. Like it's not bad by any means, but neither of those really stand out at any point. And I think against more athletic defenders, he's going to struggle probably a bit in that regard. But I think his passing reads are so quick. Like he's a very fast processor that I think if there's any sort of advantage for somebody else, he can make that pass. I just don't know if he's necessarily creating the advantage to do that, right? Like he's probably not someone that's taking somebody off the dribble consistently and able to draw in help defenders for himself. I think he's more somebody that is within like a schemed quick offense, which obviously the Kings can do. He's able to, attack, be like a second side attacker. And because he's so quick at making reads, can really be like a secondary playmaker rather than your primary. I do think, against depending on defenders, there's a chance he could be like a pinch point guard as a backup. Where if he's going against some smaller guys or guys that aren't super quick, he might be able to be usable in that sort of regard as a backup point guard. But I think for the most part, like idealistically, you want him more as a secondary playmaker.
Which is all that really Sacramento needs, especially in, of course, important to keep in mind throughout the course of this conversation. We're talking about an early second rounder. There's a lot of things that need to click. There's going to be an adjustment to the NBA. I do think he's a guy that could potentially come in and make an impact pretty quickly, but that's obviously far from a guarantee. And when it comes to that playmaking you talked about, I kind of viewed it as like somebody that will keep the advantage, but isn't really creating it, right? And you have De'Aaron and Domas to be the ones that create it. And then Colby either finishes or is able to make that next pass and sort of maintain that advantage onto the next guy. I think that playmaking is interesting. There's some skip passes in there and just sort of some creative things that had stood out to me. And I meant to ask you this a little bit earlier, but is Colby somebody that was like on people's radars in years prior?
I think last year a little bit he picked up some steam within like probably more niche draft radars than the general public. But I mean, this is obviously like the breakout year. I think some people coming into the season expected it too, like just with Xavier's roster and how they were set up. And Justin Moore coming in missing time. Like I think people just expected him to take on a bigger role, and obviously he did. I think that he's somebody that like people knew this was coming, but probably not to the extent it was coming. I didn't see it, but he's somebody that I think is going to. I'm not really concerned about. A lot of people have concerns where like upperclassmen break out of nowhere, seemingly, right? And it's like, where was this before, sort of a thing. I think Colby's always been this player. I just think this year he had the role to do it a lot more at a bigger volume, and I think that's what helped people take notice.
Yeah, and from what I saw at Xavier, like, it's kind of split between being the initiator or being the guy off ball, and playing both is obviously valuable. Having that sort of versatility just seems like a smart guy. It's something that Monty pointed out, and you can see in the players that they've targeted in years prior. Like it's a lot of high IQ guys, high character guys. There was a big emphasis on just having a healthy locker room last year, and smart players with their free flowing offense. And Xavier's offense was, at least from what I saw, I don't watch a crazy amount of college basketball outside of like looking for prospects. But I thought they had a really smooth looking offense that looked similar to what a lot of NBA teams run in Sacramento. A big that is a somewhat decent passer there as well. So I think it's pretty easy to watch some of Colby Jones' film from this year and like see the direct correlation on how that would work offensively. To sort of put a bow on the offensive conversation, do you expect that he can make an impact fairly quickly on that end of the floor, or what sort of like growing pains would you predict?
Um, yeah, I mean, I always take this standpoint of outside of like the very top guys in the draft, you probably don't want to rely necessarily on your rookie being like a high impact guy from day one or even year one a lot of the times. But I think in Colby's case, I mean he can be someone that provides value fairly quickly. You mentioned the shooting earlier. I think there's probably going to be ups and downs throughout the season with it. I don't think it's going to be a consistent thing. That's probably something that lasts throughout like the majority of his career, if I had to guess. Like it's just he's not going to be like a complete sniper, but I think he's going to be someone that's pretty serviceable on spot ups. I think that when he comes in, um, they seem to have the role figured out in terms of what they want to give him and what how they want to use him, and I think that makes a big difference. They have a plan for him. They know what he wants, what they want him to fill, and I think he can execute that. If he's playing, 12 minutes a night on your bench, coming off the bench, and maybe some spot starts here and there, I think it can do that. And as the season goes on, maybe some guys get more rest and they give him more reps in that sort of way. But I think that he's someone I feel fairly confident on the offensive end that he can come in and be outside of the shooting. Like I said, it's going to be a little inconsistent, but for the most part, be pretty consistent as a player. And I just want to rectify really quick. I know I said Justin Moore earlier. I'm getting my biggest teams mixed up because I'm super tired, but he was not on. He was not on Xavier. He's on Villanova. I just want to, for all your listeners, so they don't know I'm an idiot. I'm just really tired.
You're good. This is the time of year that tiredness is expected, so absolutely forgivable. No worries there. And just to kind of echo what you said, like it's going to sound like, I mean, Colby Jones is the guy I really liked prior to the process or prior to the draft. Um, and so it's going to sound like I'm like saying that they just drafted a guy that's instantly going to fill into the rotation. And I'm certainly not expecting that. It's unrealistic expectation for anybody really at this point in the draft. But there's the potential, and I think the benefit of this conversation is just get the idea of what he's good at, but that doesn't necessarily mean all that is going to translate to the next level. So kind of all, TBD there to see how each individual translates their game at the next level that has a lot of differences. And I guess the last thing on offense that also correlates to the defensive side of the ball is the rebounding. I think after he got drafted, one of the guys on the broadcast mentioned Josh Hart, right? Which is probably where this comparison comes from. So, or I think like a Dante DiVincenzo a little bit when I see some of Colby Jones. But what stands out to you with the rebounding? Is it just like physicality and effort, willingness, or what stands out to you? Because it is a guy that makes an impact on both sides of the floor in that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's going to be someone that's a solid rebounder. Like he's timing a lot of stuff well. You already mentioned like he's a really smart player. I think that's applicable in so many different areas of Colby. That's why I like him so much. I tend to have a sort of weakness for those guys in the draft, and I think with Colby, it shows up in his rebounding in the way that, I mean, he's not the best athlete, right? He's not a poor athlete, but he's not like any sort of crazy athlete. Um, a lot of it's just timing. Like I think he's opportunistic in his rebounds. He sees like, this guy's not all the way set. He's not all the way boxing out. Let me cut in real quick and grab that board. And I think that that's something Colby's really good at. He's not necessarily like the Brandon Podziemski's of this class where he's, after every single board running in there to grab it and has that sort of just insane motor. But I think, and that's not saying his motor is bad by any means, but he's just more opportunistic. I think he's smart in the way that he knows, this is a board I probably can get, and I'm going to expend energy on trying to get. And I think that's where a lot of the smarts come from with him.
Yeah, doing a little bit of everything definitely has some value as long as you can productively do so. And moving over to the defensive side of the ball, again, I think measurements obviously play a big impact defensively. 6'4.5", 6'8" wingspan. That's 6'4.5" without shoes. But starting with sort of him just on ball defense, from what I saw, like I thought that he was pretty good at navigating through screens. It's a lot of, again, just being a smart player, right? Like all the fundamental stuff. I thought he was really good at navigating screens. I think that recognizing the moment maybe to veer off the ball handler and go back into the big is something that he was pretty good at. And the physicalities there with decent size. Like, what do you make of his on ball defense, and how many positions could that potentially stretch through? McNair yesterday kind of, said he thinks he's a guy that can guard a lot of positions. He's like, well, maybe not the 5, which, kind of flirts with, he thinks 1 to 4, but of course Monty's going to talk up his guy that he just drafted. Where are you at with on-ball defense switchability?
I think for the majority of the league, just, obviously like these days, 1s and 2s are kind of interchangeable, but how we traditionally view like a 2 guard is probably in that more traditional sense of like a 6'4" guy that's more as a play play finisher rather than a playmaker. Like I think Colby is best probably guarding those sort of guys. I think there's room for him to guard some 3s and some 1s. I'm not comfortable saying like 1 through 3 as a blanket statement, but I think that in certain aspects and certain matchups, like I think he can hold his own in some of those matchups. And I think his on-ball defense is really good. Like I think he's not a lockdown guy. He's not going to be, putting guys through the ringer every single time they're coming down the floor. But I think he's somebody that can hold his own, hold the line. You mentioned the screen navigation. I think that's a strength of his. I also, one of my favorite aspects of his defense is just the shot contests. Like I think he's somebody that is not putting all his momentum into a shot contest, so that if that guy ends up being like a pump fake or something, he's still in the play. He's not getting blown by afterwards. And then he's not like overly hesitant either. He's not just barely, going up and giving like a half effort in terms of putting his arms up. So I think he's somebody that against like less like super bursty guards can probably hold his own for point guards. And I think against some wings that are, maybe not like the strongest ball handlers, he can probably hold his own on that regard too. He's long, like you said. He is fairly strong, like McNair said too. So I think that allows for some versatility, but probably I would say fours and fives are a little bit out of reach from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense with size considered. I mean, definitely somebody that's going to fight and try. It's just I don't know if that's the most realistic. And I think the question from Sacramento's standpoint specifically is like, if it's a team that for I think a good reason a lot of people thought of like 3-4s more so in this spot. Um, Not necessarily at 34, 38, but more of like talking 24, just what the big need is on this roster currently. And I think sort of the follow-up question on Colby's defense defensive position is that like, can you run De'Aaron Fox, Colby Jones, and Kevin Herter? I think there's some lineups where you probably can, but I think there's like questions there, right? Or if you replace either one of Kevin Herter and Malik Monk are interchangeable, and say De'Aaron Fox and Davion Mitchell are interchangeable, like any combination of three of those five guys there, I don't know that you have the most ideal amount of size. And I still think that's something you can play with, but it's one of those like, this is a team that made their living on the offensive end and wasn't very great on defense. And I've said it a lot, but I'm a big believer of like, don't work so hard to cover up your defenses that you lose your strengths in the process, which is part of this conversation. But when you hear those sort of size lineups, am I crazy thinking those sound just a little small?
No, like I think you're right. Where against a lot of teams, it's going to be probably a bit undersized. And if you are playing those sort of lineups, you probably want somebody that is going to be like a help side rim protector, because a lot of guys are probably going to try and take them to the paint, take them in the post, and try and use those size advantages um, to their advantage. So I think you are going to want to make sure that you're playing them with the right personnel behind them. I think there's some matchups where it could work. It's probably not idealistic. I think for the most part, you probably want Colby as your two, and that's not to say he can't play the one or three. And I think he can play the three, but it really depends who your one and two would be. But as you're sort of alluding to, they're not necessarily like the biggest guys to be able to do that. So, um, yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of question there, but also if you're playing a lineup where you have Colby at the two and you could put Keegan at the three a little bit, like I think there's some versatility in that sense. It's really going to be, I think, a lot of just matchup dependent, though. Ultimately, like if you're playing against a high pace team, you want to keep that pace going and keep your offense flowing like it was last year. It could make some sense to play Colby at the three and keep doing that. So, yeah, it's a little bit of questionable for sure.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think that to your point, like if you can get Keegan at the three and then that cap space you just created, I think in my mind, the idea is you try and go get a 3-4, another wing forward to fill that. And then maybe Colby Jones is your sort of middle ground option between like, Malik and Kevin Herter and Malik Monk have their things they do differently. And Colby Jones could provide you a different look in that spot here and there. When it comes to off-ball defense, definitely a guy that is disruptive. And again, this is where just being a smart player comes in. You see it on both ends of the floor. But what stands out to you most with some of his off-ball playmaking and impact defensively, or any shortcomings that come to mind?
Yeah, I think the biggest strength for me in regards to Colby's off-ball defense is just how rotationally sound he is. Again, it's going to sound like a broken record a little bit, but that's like just part of the smarts with him as a basketball player. Like he's just really savvy and knowing where he needs to position himself on the court. I think it's going to be a pretty rare instance where he's just like not where he needs to be on the court. And I think that's something that's really valuable, right? If you always have somebody that knows where they need to be, knows positionally, I need to make this rotation. That helps, and you're not giving up any sort of liability or creating any sort of openings. I think the other aspect too is you mentioned how long he is. I think he does use that a little bit in terms of he sees things rotationally really quick. So he's also able to use that wingspan to disrupt some passes. And he's not super gambly, which is great, right? Like if he's not really jumping in for this cross court sort of steal to go all the way in and giving up a 5-on-4 advantage. He's timing them well. He knows exactly, he's not the quickest, but he knows I can make this sort of steal. I can be in this position quick enough before the defense can react. So I like that about him. I think that he's not going to be like a crazy like havoc creator probably, but he is going to be someone that can occasionally disrupt a pass, deflect some stuff. And I think rotationally is always going to be sound. So I really like that. I probably like him more as an off-ball defender than I do on-ball, to be honest.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is kind of what we mentioned with Malik Monk, Kevin Huerter, and then Colby Jones being the other aspect of this. And you could throw Davion Mitchell in there too. I think everybody but Colby Jones in there really plays one side of the ball. And it's not that the other guys don't have their moments where they make an impact, but Colby's the one that I think can have a positive impact on both ends of the floor. And, obviously that he's not having the same defensive impact as Davion. He's not having the same offensive impact as Malik or Kevin Huerter. But there's a middle ground there where you can get a little bit of both potentially here. There's 3 two-way spots going into next year. I'd imagine that Keon Ellis is one of Sacramento's. He's a restricted free agent. I would think Neemias Queta. I think the time of two ways is done in my mind. It's either main roster spot or maybe he ends up going somewhere else. And then maybe Jalen Slawson, sorry. I accidentally always almost say Ron Swanson or Slamson, the Kings mascot. Really struggled with Slawson recently, but it's a work.
We always just refer him to Slaw Man on the Upside Swings podcast. Just makes it easier. Or like coleslaw, something.
I might have to adopt that one. But do you think that Colby is a guy that would, in your mind, benefit from being on a two-way and getting reps in G League? Or do you think being one of these more so well-rounded complementary guys, it would be best to, spend time with the main squad? And even if that only means you're getting reps here and there, you're still getting in practice minutes and some familiarity with the main squad. Do you have any opinions on two-way or main roster spot?
I had him top 20 on my board, so it's hard for me to say, I view him more as like a two-way guy. But that aside, like just looking at it from a Kings perspective, I think he is someone that can come in and help you. Maybe that's as the 10th man even to begin the season. But I think, being with the team, and he's not somebody that probably needs a whole lot of G League reps. He's not coming in super unpolished in a lot of different areas. So I would give him a full contract with the team. I think he's the sort of player that can live up to that throughout the season, even if it's in sparing minutes.
I like the idea. And I want to get to put out something on Twitter, kind of getting some Q&As from listeners and what they want to know about Colby. And I'll start with from Cooper here. Coop Giants 2013. Will Colby be a TD replacement? Talking about Terrence Davis and what would we expect his minutes per game to be this year? I think obviously very big difference stylistically in players, but I think the role that Terrence Davis had this year as the 5th guard on the team, he played 800 minutes last year. Actually, he was played in 64 games, which I never would have thought he actually played in 64 games. But a guy that I think is, again, your 5th guard and gives you a little bit of a different look. And maybe some of your other guys aren't getting it done. There were games last year where Coach Mike Brown is definitely one where if the starting guys aren't getting it done, that he's going to go to the bench sometimes just to prove a point to the starters rather than the bench maybe necessarily being a better option. But I think like 5th guard in the role that Terrence Davis was in, and he's a free agent, and wouldn't be surprised if he went somewhere else. Sounds like a realistic sort of spot. You're not relying on him too much, but maybe he gets opportunity here and there. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, like you said, they're very different in terms of who they are as players, but I think in terms of the sort of like just a role they can be in, I think it makes some sense. Maybe even their responsibilities are a little bit different, right? Just because they have different skill sets. But I think being that 5th guard and being somebody that can play you spot minutes here and there, I mean, you can't rely on your other 4 guards playing 82 games each, right? You're gonna have some nights where you have to slot him in and be your 4th guard, maybe even your 3rd guard some nights, worst case scenario, hopefully. So, uh, there's gonna be opportunity, I think, for him to get bigger minutes if they need it, and I think in those sort of moments, you feel comfortable with it. He's the sort of guy that you're like, he's not like, "Oh, great, we have to play, Colby instead of Davion or Herder tonight, and we're gonna probably lose." Like, I don't think that's really how you're gonna view Colby, and I think he's gonna be someone that can provide and live up to his role. He's not gonna be making a ton of crazy plays or anything, but in that sort of average, 8 to 10 minutes a night, and then if you need to bump it up some nights, I would feel comfortable with that.
Next one we got here is from Tom L. He asks, why did Colby move down in the draft? And I guess I'll reword that question of like, were you surprised at the point he fell to? I know you had him 20, but just from like what you had seen where other people had him ranked, were you shocked where he ended up going?
I wouldn't say I was shocked because, like I said, I think 25 to 35 is sort of the perceived range I had for him, where he'd go somewhere in there. And so 38's not like a huge fall from that, right? Like it's a couple of spots, but it's not nothing crazy. Um, I don't know why he did. I don't have the intel in terms of that. I think everything was wacky last night in terms of how teams are valuing injuries and intel for other players, and everything was just sort of a mess. But I think with Colby, like it's not too far away from where his range was. I was a little surprised, maybe, but I wouldn't go so far as shocked, probably.
Makes sense. And I think the last thing I want to ask you here, Stone, is just your brief thoughts on Jalen Slawson. Not somebody that I was familiar with, I will say, 5th-year guy at Furman, and my basic overview is somebody that has intrigue, again, to do a little bit of everything. Like the biggest thing to me is, oh shit, there's weak side rim protection, and Sacramento has zero possibility of weak side rim protection anywhere else on the roster. Super raw, interesting athlete at his size, but only in like very specific ways. And once you're up here, correct me if any of this is wrong at all in your mind. But like I thought vertically, he was a good athlete. In the open court, he's a good athlete, but like rotating his hips, like if he's in some sort of like drop coverage or asked to be on some quicker guys that I didn't love his speed and hips there, but where were you at with Slawson? And this is a guy that is older, again, 5th-year guy at Furman, but also somehow, in my mind, from again brief research, somebody that does have a decent amount of risk involved, which is the nature of where you're picking, obviously, at 54.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had him just on my board. I don't have the exact like in front of me number, but I know I had him as like a priority 2-way guy, so not too far off, right? I mean, usually 50 to 70 on my board. It's just guys that might get drafted, might be a 2-way. Um, he is, in my opinion, like the verticality, you're right. He was someone that, I mean, primarily thrived off of the dunker spot. That's where he's getting the majority of his finishes from. And I think that he did a pretty good job of that at Furman this year, especially. He's done it in the years prior too. Um, I think in a lot of other ways outside of that, he's just a really slow and poor athlete. Like rolling as a roller, he's pretty slow. Somebody that is not slow rotationally and recognizing things, but maybe a little slow to get there. He's just not like super athletic by any means, but he is super long, and he uses that, especially defensively, really, really well. That's like his bread and butter. It's just that he can get his hands on everything because he's got really good hands, but also he's super long and sees things really quickly. He can move with some fours well enough. Uh, but I think he's definitely someone to me that is more of like a flyer rather than I feel like this guy can make a rotation. Maybe he can, and that would be great for the Kings, obviously. But he's not somebody I'm really like expecting that out of. Um, and I'm probably lower than a lot of people in terms of the 3-point shooting with him. I think he had some good numbers this year on somewhat limited volume, but um, just overall, like the form is a little unconventional in terms of the load time and everything. And I don't love the touch outside of like what he does from the dunker spot, because most of the time those were just straight dunks. He dunked at I forget what the percentage was, but the majority of his 2 point field goals were just dunks rather than like actual finishes. So I think that he is somebody that is going to be a little bit limited offensively. He can keep the ball moving. He's not like you give it to the post and you wait for him to back guys down a little bit. But overall, I think he's just limited in terms of what he can give you on that end. And defensively, it's not enough to tip the scales for me to really see him as an NBA guy. But he's someone, like I said, I would give it 2A and see how it pans out. And seems like that's maybe how the Kings view him too. So that's where I ultimately fall down on him.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave that one to you. I got more work to do on Slawson for sure. I think that I know I'm not alone in this, but Trace Jackson Davis is somebody that I loved the idea of, and I think just duplicating sort of the Domas role, and they had a backup 5 need. I would have liked them to just try to go in that direction, but we'll see what happens with Slawson. A little bit of over sort of changed some roles over there at Stockton and 3 G League spots now. So it'll be interesting to see how Stockton looks next year. But I think that's all I got for you, Stone. I guess I said this last time, but actually, final question for you is there any teams that stand out to you throughout the draft process that you're looking at as you think they notably changed their future moving forward outside of the obvious at the top of the draft? More so thinking, from Sacramento's perspective, like, is there any teams that after yesterday you're looking at in more so in the Western Conference of like, okay, these guys got a lot better?
Yeah. I'm trying to think because it does take me a couple of days to fully grasp, everybody that got picked,
Yeah,
who went where. I mean, the Nuggets, I don't think like it was marginal improvements. They didn't have any high picks. I think it's hard to really significantly improve your standings when you're picking a bit lower, right? Like, and that's like I think the Rockets got a lot better talent. I don't see them getting a whole lot better record wise this season.
What do you
And
think of Dallas with Lively and Omax?
Yeah. So I was lower on both those guys, I think, than a lot of people. I still like Lively, and I think for me, it's a miscalculation for Dallas of drafting for fit rather than taking who else was available. But we'll see how that turns out. Like, I think Lively can be, he's probably ultimately their best rim protector now because they just don't have that. He's probably their best center. And Omax is going to fill a role because they just have 0 front court guys. I just think expecting out of rookies like that for them to come in and make an impact that really improves your record is a bit much for me. But I think they're in a better position with their front court than they were last year. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me, Stone. Again, everybody listening, Stone Hansen, co-host of the Upside Swings podcast, one of my favorite draft podcasts out there. That's at report_court on Twitter as well. Any final thoughts or anything like that before we get out of here, Stone?
Not really. I'm just, appreciative of you having me on. I always enjoy talking with you. Thanks again for, listening to the podcast. And, hopefully this is an even better, more fun Kings team than last year. And that was already a high bar. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they can do this year. And I think they're going to be a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah, appreciate you and your content and taking the time out of your day. Colby Jones already tweeted #BeamTeam, so I think we're off to a decent start here. We're gonna see how this goes. I'm a fan of Colby Jones. I think a complimentary guy that can do a little bit of everything on both ends of the floor. And say you're playing that Terrence Davis role with a guy that's a little bit more well-rounded, and you're not gonna know what you're getting right away. But I think eventually, in time, once he gets comfortable in the NBA, that Colby is more so that guy rather than maybe one day you get a 30 ball from TD and then the other he's still trying for 30, but you get about 4. So Yeah, that's sort
He's
of where
gonna
I'm at
be
with Colby.
consistent Colby. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think it's going to be just a real steady head throughout the season.
Which is needed for role players. And again, high IQ guys that can play on both ends of the floor, I think is something that Sacramento really needs. I roll my eyes at everybody comparing themselves to Denver and all of a sudden trying to be Denver, of course, because they just won a chip. But I think for Sacramento, there's decent correlations. And the smart role players of a KCP, Aaron Gordon, Christian Brown, Bruce Brown, like, sort of KCP-ish for Colby Jones here. So I like the pick. TBD, obviously. We're going to have to see how this all plays out. But thanks again, Stone, for hopping on. And thanks to everybody for listening. Definitely take a look at the Kings Herald. I'll have a profile up on Colby Jones here soon. And all the other great guys and gals are doing a lot of good work there as well. I think we're going to have a little bit of a cap rundown based on what happened in yesterday's deal in the first round, which is pretty substantial for Sacramento's offseason moving forward. So take a look at the Kings Herald and their Patreon to support local independent Kings coverage. And if you enjoyed this episode of the Kings Pulse podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. And you'll hear from me again next couple of days.